She'd been sleeping outside my door for 3 weeks. A silent, shadowy guest on the worn welcome mat I never actually used. But last night, she left something that made my chest ache. A small, damp offering placed with such deliberate care right in the center of the frayed quare. It wasn't the usual thing, a limp field mouse or a half-dead beetle, the kind of grim presence strays sometimes leave as payment for a handful of kibble. This was different. This was a single, perfect feather, a downy white plume so soft it seemed to glow in the pre-dawn gloom, and it was speckled, just faintly, with what I was desperately trying to convince myself was mud. The air in the hallway of my little apartment building always smelled like old carpet and someone else's cooking, a permanent scent of fried onions and regret. But that morning, pushing open the heavy fire door to the second-floor landing, I caught the clean, cold smell of rain-soaked earth clinging to the concrete stairs. It was that hour where the world hasn't quite decided to be day yet. The sky a dull, bruised gray outside the single window at the end of the hall. My sneakers were quiet on the linoleum, my breath a shallow thing in my chest. I was always holding my breath back then, it felt like. Trying to take up less space, to make less sound, to just be less. I'd found the apartment after everything happened. After the phone call, after the boxes were packed, after the life I thought I was building just evaporated. It was a studio, a box of a room with a kitchenette in one corner and a bathroom so small you could almost shower while sitting on the toilet. The one window looked out onto a brick wall. It was cheap, and it was quiet, and most importantly, it was a place where no one knew me. I could be anonymous there. I could be the ghost of myself. I'd moved in with 2 suitcases and a weight in my stomach that never really went away, a cold, hard stone of grief that made everything taste like ash. And then she showed up. I didn't hear her arrive that first night. I just found her there one morning, a slash of pure blackness against the dull green of the mat. She wasn't sleeping. She was sitting upright, perfectly still, her back to my door, her ears pricked forward toward the stairwell, as if she were standing guard. She was a small thing, all lean muscle and sharp angles under a coat of midnight fur. Not skinny, not starving, just wiry, purposeful. Her eyes, when she finally turned to look at me over her shoulder, were the color of old gold, of ancient coins found at the bottom of a river. I froze, my hand on the doorknob, a carton of milk held tight against my chest like a shield. She didn't flinch. She didn't hiss or run. She just held my gaze for a long, silent moment, her look unreadable, ancient. Then, with a slow, deliberate blink, she turned her face back toward the stairs, dismissing me. I remember the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears, too loud in the silent hallway. I remember the feel of the cold milk carton seeping through my thin t-shirt. I remember thinking, absurdly, that she looked like she belonged there more than I did. That was her spot, I learned. Every night, like clockwork, she would take her post. Started listening for her. My days were shapeless, a blur of too much TV and not enough sleep, but my nights gained a strange new rhythm. Around 2 a.m., I'd hear it. The softest whisper of a sound on the linoleum outside. Not the click of claws, but the nearly silent pad of paws. Then a quiet sigh, the rustle of fur as she settled in. She never scratched. She never meowed. She was just there, a silent sentinel in the dark. I began leaving things out for her. A saucer of water first. I placed it just to the side of the mat one evening, my hand trembling slightly. The next morning it was empty, licked clean. Emboldened, I bought a small bag of dry cat food from the corner bodega. The guy behind the counter knew me by then, the sad-eyed guy in 2B who bought a lot of frozen dinners. I sprinkled a little pile of kibble next to the water dish. That, too, was gone by sunrise, but she never ate or drank while I was there. Our interactions were confined to the liminal spaces of dawn and dusk, through the thin pane of glass in my door's peephole or the 2-inch gap under it. I'd kneel on the scratchy indoor-outdoor carpet of my studio and press my eye to the glass, and I'd see her, a dark shape outlined by the weak emergency light at the end of the hall. Sometimes she'd be washing a paw with fastidious care. Sometimes she'd be sitting statue still, listening to the sounds of the building settling. Sometimes I'd see the tip of her tail give the faintest, most infinitesimal twitch. I started talking to her through the door, whispering, really. My voice sounded rusty from disuse. "Hey there, little shadow," I'd say. "Cold out tonight?" It was stupid, but it was the most I'd spoken to another living soul in days. The silence in my apartment had started to feel heavy, suffocating. A physical presence pressing in on me. Her presence on the other side of that door. It somehow made the silence inside feel less empty. It was a shared silence, a companionable one. I wondered where she came from. This wasn't a neighborhood with many strays. It was all concrete and traffic and closed-up shops. Maybe she belonged to someone in the building, but no one ever came looking for her. No collar, no tags. She was a creature of the in-between, of the lonely hours, just like me. And then the full moon came. It was the first one since she'd started her vigil. I remember because the light through my lone window was unusually bright, casting a silvery rectangle on my floor. I couldn't sleep. The stone of grief in my gut felt heavier on those nights, the memories sharper, more painful. I finally got up and went to the door, kneeling to look through the peephole. The hallway was empty. The mat was bare. A ridiculous pang of disappointment shot through me. She'd left. Of course she'd left. She was a cat. She didn't owe me anything. She probably found a warmer doorstep, a better food source. I stayed there for a long time, my knee going numb on the carpet, just staring at the empty space. The silence in my apartment rushed back in, louder than ever. I felt like a fool for thinking her presence meant something, for thinking anything meant anything anymore. But the next night, she was back. Right on time. The food was eaten. The water was gone. And everything was back to normal. Until the next full moon. Again she vanished. No sign of her all night. And again she returned the following evening, as if nothing had happened. It became a pattern. A strange, silent ritual I didn't understand. I started to mark the lunar cycles on my calendar, a little circle around the date. It gave my days a weird new focal point. The approach of the full moon would bring a low thrum of anxiety. Would this be the night she didn't come back? The night her mysterious other life finally claimed her for good? I'd lie in bed, listening for the sound of her paws, and when it didn't come, a part of me would feel abandoned. All over again. It was stupid to project so much onto a stray cat. I knew that. But she was the only constant in my life. The only thing that showed up, night after night, without fail. Except for those nights. Those brilliant moon-drenched nights. The gift of the feather changed everything. It was a message. I didn't know what it meant, not yet. But it was a direct communication from her world to mine. It was evidence that she knew I was here, that she saw me, that our connection, however fragile and strange, was real. She wasn't just a cat getting a free meal. She was a creature with a secret, and she was starting to trust me with it. The ache in my chest wasn't just sadness anymore. It was curiosity. It was the first flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Wonder. The quiet knowledge settled over me that morning, holding that feather so carefully in my palm, that something had begun. A story was unfolding right outside my door, and I was no longer just a spectator. I was a part of it. You're here, listening, and that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. The days began to bleed into one another, each one a little softer around the edges than the last. Not because anything in my life had fundamentally changed, but because my world now had a center of gravity, a fixed point around which everything else quietly orbited. Her. The small black cat who slept outside my door. I started calling her Luna, not out loud, not yet, but in the quiet of my own mind. It was a secret name, a name that held the mystery of her monthly disappearances, a name that felt soft and old on my tongue. It felt right. My routine, once a shapeless drift from bed to couch to fridge and back again, solidified around her. Mornings were no longer about dragging myself into another gray day. They were about the quiet anticipation of opening the door. I'd wake up, and the first thing I'd feel wasn't the heavy weight of grief, but a low hum of curiosity. Was she there? Had she eaten the food? I'd make my coffee, the cheap machine gurgling and hissing in the small silence of the studio, and I'd wait, letting the steam warm my face. I'd wait until I was sure the building was still mostly asleep, until the old man in 2A had finished his coughing fit, until the woman downstairs had left for her early shift, the bang of the main door echoing up the stairwell. I wanted this moment to be just ours, unobserved. Then I'd open the door. Just a crack at first. The hinge always gave a low, tired groan. I'd see the empty saucer, licked clean, and the little ceramic bowl I'd bought for her food, also empty. And I'd see her. She was never right in front of the door in the morning. She was always a few feet down the hall, sitting by the top of the stairs, her body angled away from me, but one ear swiveled back, tracking my every movement. She was watching the world wake up, or perhaps making sure nothing could sneak up on us. Her guard duty was over for the night, but her vigilance never really ended. I started taking my coffee sitting on the floor in the doorway, my back against the door jamb, my legs stretched out onto the cold linoleum. I'd just sit there, sipping the bitter brew, and we'd share the morning. I'd talk to her, not whispers through the door anymore, but my normal, quiet voice. It felt less rusty with each passing day. Rough night? I'd ask her, watching the way she held herself, so still and regal. You look like you've been thinking deep thoughts. She'd ignore me, of course, but her tail would give that tiny, almost imperceptible twitch at the very tip, the only sign she was even aware of my presence. It was enough. The space between us began to feel charged, but not with tension, with a kind of patient electricity. We were two solitary creatures, learning the map of each other's silence. I learned her language. The slow blink was the first word I understood. I'd catch her looking at me, those ancient gold coins of eyes fixed on me. And then she'd close them, slowly, deliberately, and open them again. It wasn't a sleepy blink. It was measured, meaningful. I looked it up one day on my phone, my screen glowing in the dark of my apartment. Cats slow blink to show they are comfortable and trust you, the article said. It's like a kitty kiss, a kitty kiss. I started doing it back. I'd sit in the doorway, and when she glanced my way, I'd slow blink at her. She'd look away, but a moment later I'd see her perform the ritual herself. We were having conversations without a single sound. Her gifts became a regular thing. Not every morning, but often enough. The feather was joined by others. A smooth gray river stone, cool to the touch. A piece of gnarled, interesting bark. A single, vibrant red leaf, perfectly preserved. They were never dead things, never trophies from a hunt. They were treasures, selections. Each one felt considered. I started a little collection of them on the windowsill next to my bed, arranging them carefully. My windowsill, which had been empty and dusty for months, now held a tiny museum of her journeys. It was the first thing I'd see in the morning and the last thing I'd see at night. It was the first beauty I'd allowed into my life in a long time. The weather turned. The clean, cold smell of rain was replaced by a sharper, metallic tang in the air. Winter was coming. You could feel it in the bite of the wind that whistled under the front door of the building. You could see it in the frost that began to lace the edges of the window in the hall each morning. I worried about her. My studio was warm, stuffy even with the ancient radiator banging and clanging, but the hallway was a drafty, cold conduit to the outside world. I bought a small, plush cat bed from the pet store 2 blocks over. It was a ridiculous, bright purple thing, but it looked soft and warm. I felt a flush of self-consciousness carrying it back through my neighborhood. the bright plastic bag crinkling loudly. What was I doing? I was a man in my 30s buying a cat bed for a feral cat who might never use it. But the thought of her out in the cold, of her sleek black fur getting dusted with frost, was unbearable. That night, I placed the new bed squarely in the center of her mat. I even put one of my old t-shirts in it, something that smelled like me, something that might say, "This is a safe place. This is your place." The next morning, I opened the door with a nervousness I hadn't felt in weeks. The bed was untouched. She was sitting in her usual spot by the stairs, and the purple bed looked garish and foolish under the dim hall light. Of course she didn't use it. I'd been presumptuous. I left it there for a few days, a monument to my own sentimentality. Every morning, it was pristine, the plush fabric undisturbed. And then, on the third morning, I saw it. The bed hadn't been moved, but the t-shirt inside was rumpled. It had been clearly slept on, the fabric pressed down in a distinct small circle. She hadn't deigned to get in the bed, but she had slept on it, on my shirt. It was a compromise, a massive one. I felt a surge of victory so pure and simple it was almost dizzying. I sat down in the doorway with my coffee, my heart feeling too big for my chest. "Good morning," I said to her, and I swear, for the first time, she turned her head and looked directly at me for a full 3 seconds before turning back to her watch. It felt like a benediction. The bond was building itself, brick by tiny, invisible brick. It was in the way she no longer tensed when I opened the door. It was in the way she'd sometimes be waiting closer to my doorstep in the evenings, as if anticipating my arrival home from my pointless walks around the neighborhood. It was in the way the silence between us was no longer empty, but full of trust being built, millimeter by millimeter. Have you ever had an animal wait for you, even when you didn't ask them to? It does something to you. It unravels a knot you didn't even know you were carrying. For months, I had felt like a ghost in my own life, unseen, unheard, untethered. But she saw me. She waited for me. Her silent, consistent presence was a mirror held up to my own, reflecting back not a ghost, but a person worthy of waiting for. It was the smallest, most profound validation I had ever received. I began to wonder about her life beyond this hallway. Where did she go during the day? The food was always gone by morning, so she came under cover of darkness to eat. But sometimes, on weekends when I was home, I'd open the door in the afternoon to take out the trash, and I'd see her, not on the mat, but out the hall window, a black speck moving with liquid grace along the top of the brick wall that separated our building from the auto body shop next door. She moved like she owned the entire world, every inch of it. She was a queen surveying her kingdom. I'd watch her until she disappeared from view, a feeling of pride swelling in me. That's my girl, I'd think, and then immediately feel silly for the possessiveness of the thought. She wasn't mine. I was hers. The biggest shift happened on a Tuesday. It had been a bad day. The kind of day where the grief felt fresh again, where a song on the radio or a certain slant of light could bring it all back, sharp and suffocating. I'd spent the afternoon lying on the couch, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, feeling the cold stone in my gut expand until it felt like it was filling my whole body. I skipped dinner. I just went to bed early, pulling the covers over my head, trying to shut out the world. I must have fallen into a fitful sleep because I was jerked awake by a sound. Not a loud sound. A tiny scraping noise at the door. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was late, much later than she usually arrived. The hall was pitch black outside my peephole. I crept to the door and knelt down, my ear pressed against the cool wood. I heard it again, a soft scraping sound, then a silence, and then the smallest, most hesitant sound I had ever heard. It was so quiet I almost missed it. A meow, a single, raspy, questioning meow. It wasn't a cry for food. It was a question. "Are you there?" I didn't think. I just moved. I unlocked the door and opened it, just a few inches. She was right there, sitting on the welcome mat, her face tilted up to mine. Her eyes were wide, her ears pricked forward. She wasn't guarding. She wasn't waiting. She was checking on me. We stared at each other across the threshold, the warm, stuffy air of my apartment meeting the cold, drafty air of the hall. This was the line we had never crossed, the invisible barrier between her world and mine. The space between my door and the jam felt vast, charged with unspoken possibility. And then she did it. She took a single step forward. She didn't rush in. She didn't bolt. She placed one delicate black paw over the threshold and onto the scratchy indoor-outdoor carpet of my studio. She paused there, her body still in the hall, her head turned, looking into my space, her whiskers twitching as she sampled the air. She was deciding. I held my breath. I didn't move a muscle. I was afraid that even the beat of my heart would be too loud, would scare her back into the shadows. She looked up at me again, and in the dim light bleeding from my apartment, I saw it. A slow, deliberate blink. A kitty kiss. And then she leaned forward, not to come in, but to press the top of her head, the smooth, solid space between her ears, against the knuckles of my hand where it rested on the door frame. The touch was electric. Her fur was shockingly soft, and she was warm, so warm. She pressed her head into my hand once, a firm, purposeful gesture, and then immediately withdrew, turning and melting back into the darkness of the hallway. She didn't look back. She just went to her spot by the stairs and began meticulously washing the paw that had crossed the line, as if such a monumental act required immediate and thorough cleansing. I closed the door slowly, my legs shaky. I slid down to the floor, my back against the wood. I brought my hand up to my face. I could still feel the ghost of her warmth, the impression of her skull against my skin. It was the first time she had ever touched me, the first time she had ever initiated contact. It wasn't a request for food. It wasn't a demand for shelter. It was a gesture of pure, simple connection, a comfort. She knew. Somehow, on some deep instinctual level, she knew it had been a bad day, and she had come to tell me she was there. I sat there on the floor for a long time, in the dark of my apartment, and for the first time since I'd moved in, I didn't feel alone. The stone of grief in my stomach was still there. It would probably always be there, but it felt smaller somehow, lighter, because now it wasn't mine to carry alone. I had a friend, a small, black, mysterious friend, who blinked kitty kisses and brought me feathers and pressed her warm head against my hand in the dead of night. The bond was no longer being built out in the hall. It was inside me now, a living, breathing thing, and it had finally, irrevocably, broken its usual distance. The head press changed everything. It was a key turning in a lock I hadn't even known was there. After that night, the invisible barrier between our worlds didn't just feel crossed, it felt dissolved. She still didn't come inside, not fully, but the doorway became a shared space, a neutral territory where the rules were rewritten by that single seismic gesture of trust. My apartment was no longer just my lonely box. It was a place she sometimes deigned to touch with one careful paw. The hallway was no longer just her cold, drafty post. It was a place where I was welcome to sit and share the silence. Her visits became more varied. She still kept her night watch with unwavering dedication. But now, sometimes, she'd appear during the day. I'd be washing a dish at the sink, staring out at the brick wall, and a flicker of movement would catch my eye. There she'd be, a slash of darkness against the rust-red brick, moving with that liquid, effortless grace. She'd pause, seeing me in the window, and her tail would give a single, slow lift. Not a wave, not a greeting, but an acknowledgement. I see you too. Then she'd continue on her way, off to the mysteries of her daylight kingdom. I started buying better food. The cheap kibble from the bodega felt like an insult now. I went back to the pet store and stood in the aisle, bewildered by the options. Grain-free, salmon recipe, with freeze-dried chicken. I chose the most expensive bag I could justify, one with a picture of a glossy, contented cat that looked nothing like my sleek, wild-eyed girl. That night, I poured the new food into her bowl. It smelled vaguely of fish and herbs. She arrived at her usual time, her paws making their nearly silent pad on the linoleum. I heard her stop at the bowl. There was a long pause. Then the sound of her sniffing, intensely, critically. Another pause. Then the delicate crunch of her eating. She approved. Of course she did. She had expensive taste. I found myself smiling in the dark, leaning against my side of the door, feeling ridiculously pleased that I'd passed the test. The gifts continued, but their nature began to shift. The feathers and stones and leaves were still there, but they were joined by other things, odder things, things that felt less like treasures and more like clues. A button from a man's dress shirt still trailing a few threads. A shard of sea glass, worn smooth and milky by the ocean, which was miles and miles from our concrete neighborhood. A single, tiny, porcelain doll's shoe, chipped and ancient-looking. Where was she finding these things? They felt like artifacts from other lives, other stories, things that had no business being in her world of alleyways and brick walls. Each new offering felt like a sentence in a story I couldn't quite read. I'd hold the sea glass in my palm, its surface cool and impossibly smooth, and try to imagine her journey. Did she travel that far? Did some kid drop it in a playground sandbox miles away, and she, with her impeccable taste for the unique, had plucked it from the grains? It seemed impossible. Yet, there it was. The lunar cycle became the drumbeat of our strange little life. I'd circle the full moon on my calendar, and as the date approached, a new kind of tension would thrum in the air. It wasn't just my anxiety about her leaving anymore. It was in her, too. In the days leading up to the full moon, she'd grow restless. Her vigilance at the top of the stairs became more intense, her ears constantly swiveling, tracking sounds I couldn't hear. She'd spend less time sitting calmly and more time pacing the length of the hallway. A silent black panther in a 10-foot-long jungle. Her movements were sharper, her energy coiled tight. She'd still take the food, but she'd eat quickly, distractedly, her head snapping up at the slightest noise. The slow blinks became less frequent. She was gearing up for something, preparing. The bond between us felt stretched thin during those days, as if she were already halfway gone, her mind pulled by a tide I couldn't see. And then the moon would rise, full and brilliant, washing the world in its cold, blue-silver light. And she would vanish, every time. It was as reliable as the tide. No good-night head press, no final glance. She'd just be gone. The hallway would feel cavernously empty, the purple bed a monument to her absence. Those nights were the hardest. The silence in my apartment would feel aggressive again, a void where her quiet presence had been. I'd lie in bed, staring at the moonlit rectangle on my floor, and my mind would conjure up 1,000 terrible scenarios. Had a car hit her? Had animal control picked her up? Had she found another person? Someone with a bigger house, a warmer welcome, and decided to stay? The fear was a physical ache, a cold knot in my stomach that felt sickeningly familiar. It was the same feeling I'd had after the phone call, the feeling of a vital connection suddenly, brutally severed. I knew it was irrational to feel this way about a cat, a stray who owed me nothing. But she wasn't just a cat anymore. She was my anchor. She was the reason my days had shape. Losing her felt like losing my footing all over again. The morning after the full moon, I'd be a wreck. I'd wake up before dawn, my heart already pounding with a low-grade dread. I'd delay opening the door, nursing my coffee for an hour, afraid of the emptiness I'd find. But she always came back. Always. She'd be there, sitting by the stairs, but she'd look different. Worn out. Her sleek fur would be dusty, sometimes matted with a burr or a twig. There'd be a quiet exhaustion in her posture, a profound tiredness that went deeper than a mere lack of sleep. Her eyes, when she finally looked at me, held a distant look, as if she were remembering something from a long, long time ago. She'd be ravenous, devouring the food I put out, and then she'd retreat to her bed. Our bed, the one with my t-shirt, and she'd sleep a sleep so deep and motionless it sometimes scared me. She wouldn't just nap, she'd collapse. It was the sleep of someone who had run a great distance, who had completed a monumental task. She'd sleep through the entire day sometimes, barely stirring when the mailman slammed the boxes shut downstairs or when I sat in the doorway to watch over her. I started to notice other things, small details that fed the mystery. A faint, earthy smell clung to her on those post-moon mornings. Not the smell of garbage or city grime, but the clean, deep scent of damp soil and fallen leaves. The smell of the woods. But the nearest real woods were a state park, a good 45-minute drive away. There were a few scraggly trees in the vacant lots around here, but nothing that would produce that rich, loamy perfume. One morning, after a particularly bright full moon, I found her not just dusty, but with her paw pads lightly stained a reddish-brown, as if she'd been walking through clay. I knelt beside her as she slept in her bed, my heart hammering. Gently, so gently, I reached out and touched the back of her leg. She didn't stir. I ran my thumb over the pad of her paw. It was rough, but the stains were unmistakable. It was dirt, real, proper dirt. Not the oily dirt of the city, but the kind of soil you find out in the country. What was she doing? Where was she going? The gifts, the restlessness, the exhaustion, the smell of the forest on her fur. It all pointed to a secret life, a purpose far beyond the simple stray cat narrative I'd constructed for her. She wasn't just wandering. She was journeying. She was on a mission. The worry began to curdle into a deep, gnawing fear. This wasn't just a quirky habit. It felt dangerous. She was coming back tired and dirty. But what if one time she came back injured? What if one time she didn't come back at all? The thought was a cold fist closing around my heart. I couldn't lose her, not now, not after she'd pulled me back from the edge of my own grief. I found myself watching her more intently, studying her like a text I was desperate to translate. I started taking pictures of the gifts she brought, arranging them on my windowsill and snapping them with my phone, trying to find a pattern. Button, feather, sea glass, stone. They seemed random. But were they? The doll's shoe was so specific, so strange. It felt old, valuable, in a sentimental way. Had she taken it from somewhere? From someone? Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest? I know they do. She knew I was fragile. She'd pressed her head against my hand on my worst night. And now, I felt like she was the fragile one. She was pushing herself too hard, driven by some instinct I couldn't understand. I wanted to protect her, to bundle her up and keep her safe in my warm, boring apartment. But I knew she'd never allow it. Her freedom, her secret mission, was too much a part of who she was. The fear made me bold. One evening, a few days before the next full moon was due, I did something I'd never considered before. As she finished her dinner, I slowly reached out my hand, not to pet her, but towards her collar. She didn't have one, but I'd seen a thin, almost invisible line of lighter fur around her neck. A ghost of a collar long since gone. Maybe, just maybe, she'd been microchipped by a previous owner. Maybe there was an answer there. My fingers were inches from her neck when she froze. Not a tense freeze, but a sudden, absolute stillness. She stopped chewing. She stopped breathing. Every muscle in her body locked. She didn't look at me. She just stared straight ahead at the wall, her eyes wide and unblinking. It was a rejection so total, so profound, that I instantly pulled my hand back, as if I'd been burned. The air between us went cold. After a long moment, she finished her mouthful of food, turned without a single glance in my direction, and walked away down the hall, her tail held low. She didn't go to her spot by the stairs. She just disappeared down the steps and into the night. I had crossed a line. I had tried to contain her, to define her, to solve her. And she would not be solved. She would not be contained. The trust we'd built, brick by painstaking brick, felt like it was crumbling. I spent a miserable night, sick with regret. I'd tried to put a leash on the moon. It was the dumbest thing I could have possibly done. She didn't come back the next night. The food sat uneaten. The hallway was empty. The silence was back, and it was my fault. The cold knot of fear in my stomach was now mixed with a heavy sludge of guilt. I'd ruined it. I'd scared her away for good. But on the second night, she returned. She didn't look at me. She ate the food quickly, warily, her body angled away from my open door. She didn't leave a gift. She didn't perform a slow blink. She was a stranger again, a wary shadow. The pattern had been broken, not by the moon, but by me. The fragile connection had been severed. And then, the night of the full moon arrived. The sky outside my window was clear, the moon a perfect, brilliant white coin. I listened for her, but I knew she wouldn't come. Why would she? I'd broken the spell. I went to bed early, pulling the covers over my head, trying to block out the accusing light of the moon. But around 2 a.m., I heard it, the soft pad of paws on linoleum. My heart leapt into my throat. She'd come. She'd come on a full moon night, which she never did. This was it. This was her goodbye. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't restless. She was just sitting there, on the welcome mat, staring directly at my door. Her eyes looked huge in the dim light, and her chest was moving rapidly, as if she'd been running. This was different. This was all wrong. And then she did something she had never, ever done before. She meowed. Not a question, not a raspy little sound. It was a clear, sharp, piercing cry. It echoed in the empty hallway, a sound of pure, undiluted urgency. She meowed again, staring right at the peephole, right at me. She wasn't leaving for her mysterious journey. She was asking me to follow her. The sound of her meow wasn't a sound you could ignore. It wasn't the plaintive cry of a hungry animal or the annoyed yowl of a creature inconvenienced. It was a command, a desperate, piercing summons that cut through the wood of the door and lodged itself directly into some primal part of my brain. Follow. Now, my body moved before my mind could catch up, fueled by a surge of adrenaline that made my hands tremble as I fumbled with the locks. The deadbolt turned with a heavy, metallic clunk that sounded obscenely loud in the silent building. The chain rattled as I slid it free. I didn't think about pulling on shoes or a jacket. I didn't think about grabbing my phone. I was in a pair of thin sweatpants and a t-shirt, my feet bare on the cold linoleum as I pulled the door open. She was there, a statue of tension and midnight fur. The moment the door opened, she turned and streaked down the hallway, a black blur against the green walls. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew I was following. Her cry had forged a tether between us, and she was pulling me along its length. I stumbled after her, my bare feet slapping against the cold floor. The stairs were a dizzying plunge. She took them not in steps, but in leaps, flowing down them like water. I half ran, half fell, grabbing the shaky banister to keep from tumbling. The main door to the building was usually locked from the outside, but it was propped open tonight with a crumpled beer can, letting in a slice of the cold, moon-washed night. She slipped through the gap without breaking stride. I shoved the heavy door open, the metal groaning in protest, and burst out into the street. The cold hit me like a physical blow. The air was freezing, biting into my thin clothes, raising instant goosebumps on my arms. The pavement was like ice under my bare feet, gritty with sand and litter. But I barely registered it. All I could see was her. She was already across the street, a darting shadow flowing through the pools of sodium-orange light from the street lamps. She paused for a fraction of a second at the opposite curb, her head turning, her eyes catching the light and flashing like twin beacons. This way. Hurry. And then she was running again, cutting down an alley I'd never ventured into, an alley choked with overflowing dumpsters and the sharp, sour smell of rot and stale beer. I followed, my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat matching the pace of my flight. My feet were freezing, and I winced as I stepped on something sharp, a piece of glass or a stone, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The pull was too strong. This was madness. This was a dream. Running barefoot through the sleeping city in the middle of the night, chasing a cat. A month ago, I would have been curled in a ball on my couch, drowning in my own sorrow. Now I was sprinting through the cold, alive with a terrifying electric purpose. The grief, the heavy stone that had lived in my gut for so long, was still there, but it was overshadowed, forgotten in the sheer animal urgency of the moment. She led me on a twisting, turning path, a route only she knew. We left the main streets behind, cutting through back lots and across vacant properties, where weeds grew through cracks in the concrete. The world was reduced to the silver wash of the moon overhead, the burning cold in my lungs, and the flicker of her tail just ahead. Always just ahead, guiding me. The sounds of the city faded away. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional siren, replaced by the sound of my own ragged breathing and the soft, frantic patter of my feet. We came to a chain-link fence, rusted and sagging. She slipped through a hole at the bottom without a pause. I grabbed the cold, rough metal, the chill searing my palms, and hauled myself over, the fence rattling and shaking like a thunderclap in the quiet night. I landed hard on the other side, the impact jarring my teeth. We were in a different world now. The hard edges of the city were softening. There were trees here, real trees, not the stunted, struggling ones in sidewalk pits. This was a forgotten scrap of land on the city's edge, a place where nature was slowly, stubbornly, taking back its territory. The ground under my feet changed from concrete to hard-packed earth, then to a carpet of fallen leaves and pine needles. It was colder, softer. The air began to change, too. The city smells of exhaust and garbage were gradually replaced by that same clean, damp, earthy scent that always clung to her after her journeys, the scent of the woods. We were heading into the patch of forest that bordered the train tracks, a place I'd only ever seen from the window of a moving car. She slowed her pace here, her movements becoming more deliberate, more cautious. She wasn't just running now, she was navigating. I followed, my breath pluming in the frigid air, my body shaking with a combination of cold and a fear that was now laced with a dizzying sense of awe. The moonlight filtered down through the bare branches of the trees, creating a complex tapestry of light and shadow. It was beautiful and terrifyingly silent. She led me deeper, away from any distant glow of the city. The only light was the moon, a cold, merciless eye watching our progress. The trees grew closer together. I had to duck under low-hanging branches, my bare feet sinking into cold, damp mulch. The world had shrunk to this. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the whisper of the wind in the pines, and the silent, determined form of the cat ahead of me. And then she stopped. We were in a small clearing, a bowl of moonlight surrounded by a dense thicket of brambles and young saplings. In the center of the clearing was the skeleton of something old. A fallen tree, perhaps, or the remains of a long-rotted shed. It was a jumble of weathered gray wood, being slowly consumed by moss and ivy. Luna sat down at the edge of the clearing, her body still. She wasn't looking at the structure. She was looking at me. Her message was delivered. She had brought me here. The rest was up to me. My legs were trembling so badly I could barely stand. The cold was seeping deep into my bones, a deep, shivering ache. I took a step into the clearing, then another, my senses screaming. The silence was absolute, profound. It was the kind of silence that feels like a presence itself. I moved toward the pile of wood, my heart in my throat. What was I supposed to find? What had she been trying to show me all these months with her feathers and her stones? What was so important that she had to bring me here, now, under the full moon. As I got closer, I saw it wasn't just a random pile. It was a structure, low to the ground, deliberate. There was a dark space underneath it, a cavity sheltered by the collapsed wood. It looked like a den. A low, soft sound reached my ears, a sound so faint I thought I'd imagined it. A tiny, mewling cry, then another. It was coming from under the wood. My breath hitched. I dropped to my knees, the cold and damp of the earth instantly soaking through the thin fabric of my sweatpants. I didn't care. I leaned forward, peering into the darkness of the den. The moonlight didn't penetrate there. It was a pool of absolute blackness. The mewling came again, slightly louder this time, a helpless, hungry sound. And then a pair of eyes opened in the darkness, tiny, baby blue eyes, unseeing and new. They blinked slowly. Then another pair opened nearby, and another. My hand flew to my mouth. I wasn't breathing. I was frozen, kneeling in the dirt, staring into the den. A small, frail calico head lifted weakly, its mouth opening in a silent cry. It was a kitten. They were all kittens, a whole litter of them, nestled in a shallow depression lined with dried leaves and feathers, white downy feathers, just like the one she had left on my welcome mat, and bits of soft moss, and a frayed piece of red ribbon, and a tiny, chipped porcelain doll's shoe. The collection on my windowsill. It wasn't a collection of treasures. It was a shopping list. It was a test. She'd been bringing me samples of the materials she was using, the things she needed to make a soft, warm, safe place for her babies. She'd been showing me, and I'd been too stupid, too wrapped up in my own human sentimentality to understand. A movement at the edge of the den caught my eye. Luna had crept forward silently. She moved past me, her body low to the ground, and slipped into the den with a fluid, practiced motion. She settled herself among the squirming, mewling pile of kittens, and I heard the sound of contented purring, a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath my knees. She began to clean them, her rough tongue moving over their tiny heads with a tenderness that made my chest ache. She wasn't just a stray. She was a mother. This was her secret. This was where she vanished to every full moon. Not to hunt, not to wander, but to give birth, to nurse her babies in this hidden sacred place she had found for them. The exhaustion, the smell of the earth, the desperate hunger when she returned. It all made a terrible, beautiful sense. She looked up from her kittens, her golden eyes finding mine in the dim light. There was no fear in them, no wariness. There was only a deep, bottomless trust. She had brought me to her most precious, most vulnerable secret. She had shown me her heart. The understanding didn't come in a single blinding flash. It washed over me slowly, like the rising tide, and with it came a wave of emotion so powerful it buckled me. A sob broke from my throat, a raw, ragged sound that shattered the sacred silence of the clearing. I couldn't stop them. The tears came, hot and fast, streaming down my cold cheeks, dripping onto the leaves below. I cried for her strength, for her fierce, wild motherhood. I cried for the trust she had placed in me, a broken man she had chosen to share her world with. I cried for the sheer, staggering beauty of it all. I was trembling violently from the cold, from the shock, from the overwhelming flood of feeling. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to hold myself together, but I was coming apart at the seams. Luna watched me cry. She didn't look away. She just continued to purr, a steady, grounding rhythm in the chaos of my emotions. Then she gently extricated herself from the pile of sleeping kittens. She stepped out of the den and walked over to where I knelt, a broken statue in the moonlight. She didn't rub against me. She didn't meow. She simply pressed the entire length of her body against my shivering leg, a solid, warm, living weight. She leaned into me, sharing her warmth, her strength. She held me up as I fell apart. It was the most unmistakable gesture of love I had ever received. It was an absolution. It was a gift. In that moment, kneeling in the dirt under the full moon, with a queen and her secret court, I finally saw what she had been trying to tell me all along. It wasn't about the gifts. It was about the giving. It was about the fierce, protective, nurturing love that survives in the hidden corners of the world. It was about trust, fragile and hard-won. It was about showing someone your secret den, your most vulnerable heart, and knowing, finally, that you are not alone. The walk back was a dream, a slow, shivering pilgrimage through the silver and black world. I was barely aware of my own body, of the cold seeping into my bones, of the sharp stones and twigs biting into my bare feet. I moved as if in a trance, cradling the cardboard box against my chest like the most sacred, most fragile thing in the universe. Inside, nestled in the old flannel shirt, was the entire world. Luna led the way, her pace slow and measured now, no longer a frantic dash, but a solemn procession. She stopped every few feet, turning to look back at me, her eyes checking on her precious cargo, on the man carrying it. Her trust was a physical weight, a mantle placed on my shoulders that I vowed, with every fiber of my being, not to betray. The city slowly reassembled itself around us, the quiet woods giving way to the alleys and streets. The world was still asleep. We were ghosts moving through a paused film. My teeth were chattering uncontrollably by the time we reached my building, my body racked with shivers. The climb up the stairs was an agony of cold and exhaustion, each step a monumental effort. Luna flowed up ahead of me, a patient guide. Pushing open the door to my apartment was like crossing into another dimension. The air was stiflingly warm, thick with the smell of stale coffee and my own loneliness. It felt like a lifetime ago that I had lived here. The place seemed smaller, shabbier, and yet it was different. It was no longer just a box I hid in. It was a potential sanctuary, a haven. I carried the box to the center of the room, my arms screaming with fatigue, and set it down with infinite care on the scratchy carpet. I didn't turn on the overhead light. The gray pre-dawn light filtering through the window was enough. Luna immediately jumped into the box, circling once before settling down amongst her babies, her purr kicking back up into that low, resonant motor of contentment. The kittens, disturbed by the move, began to mewl softly, nuzzling against her, seeking warmth and milk. The sound was tiny, a symphony of new life playing in the stale air of my old life. I stood there for a long moment, just watching them. The reality of what had happened, of what was now in my home, began to truly sink in. The shock and the cold started to recede, and in their place came a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated panic. What had I done? I was a mess. I could barely take care of myself. My fridge was mostly empty. My life was a stalled engine. I had no idea how to care for a cat, let alone a mother cat and a litter of newborn kittens. What did they eat? Were they warm enough? Was it too bright? Too dark? What if I did something wrong? What if I accidentally hurt them? The weight of responsibility was crushing, 1,000 times heavier than the grief I'd been carrying. Grief was passive. This was active. This was life, fragile and demanding, placed directly into my shaking, incompetent hands. I must have made a sound, a gasp of pure terror, because Luna looked up from her nursing. She blinked her slow, deliberate blink at me. Then she gently extracted herself from the pile of kittens, who complained with tiny squeaks. She jumped out of the box and came over to where I stood, frozen in a panic attack. She wound herself once, twice around my icy bare ankles, the pressure firm and calming. Her purr vibrated through the floor and into my bones. It was as if she were saying, "Breathe. Just breathe. We are here now. Together." Her calmness was an anchor. I took a ragged, shuddering breath. Then another. The panic receded, not gone, but manageable. She was right. We were here. Together. The first thing I did was find an old blanket and drape it over the box, creating a dark, cozy cave for them. Then I stumbled into the kitchen. My hands were still trembling as I filled a bowl with water and another with the expensive kibble she liked. I brought them over and set them near the box. Luna sniffed the food and began to eat with a quiet, grateful intensity. I sat on the floor beside them, my back against the couch, and just watched. The sun began to rise properly, turning the gray light in the room to a soft, buttery gold. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, and it fell on the box, on the small, miraculous family within it. I must have dozed off, because I was jolted awake by a sound, a tiny, persistent mewling. One of the kittens, a little black one with a single white sock on its back paw, had clambered over the side of the box and was now stumbling across the carpet. Its eyes still sealed shut, its tiny nose twitching. Luna watched from the box, her expression calm. She made no move to retrieve it. She was letting it explore. She was trusting me with it. My heart swelled until I thought it might burst. I slowly reached out a single finger and placed it in the kitten's path. It bumped into my finger, sniffed it, and then, with a strength that belied its size, clambered right onto my hand, its tiny claws pricking my skin like pins. It settled into the curve of my palm, gave a contented sigh, and fell asleep. The weight of it was nothing, and yet it was everything. It was the weight of the future. It was the weight of trust. It was the weight of a second chance. That was how the days began to unfold. Not with a dramatic fanfare, but with a soft, gradual unfurling, like a flower opening to the sun. My life, which had been so silent and still, was now filled with sound. The tiny mews of the kittens, the contented rumble of Luna's purr, the soft crunch of kibble, the frantic pitter-patter of tiny paws on linoleum as the kittens grew and began to explore. I became an expert. I researched online. I bought kitten formula just in case, special wet food for Luna, a bigger, better bed. My apartment, once so sterile and empty, became a landscape of cozy blankets, scattered toys, and food bowls. The windowsill collection of treasures was joined by a new exhibit, a growing pile of kitten-related paraphernalia. Luna was a devoted, incredible mother. She was patient and fierce and loving, but she also continued to be her. She still needed her space, her sovereignty. Once the kittens were weaned and stable, she resumed her patrols. She'd hop out the window I now kept cracked open for her and vanish for a few hours during the day, returning with the smell of the outdoors on her fur. She'd come back and check on her brood, often leaving me a small gift on the windowsill, a particularly interesting leaf, a shiny piece of foil, before settling down to wash a kitten or simply watch over them with her calm, golden eyes. She had brought them to me, but she had not given up her freedom. She had simply expanded her kingdom to include me and my small apartment. We were partners in this, co-parents. The stone of grief in my gut didn't vanish, but it changed. It was no longer a cold, hard weight of absence. It became something else, a touchstone, a reminder of the love that had once been there, a love that had somehow, inexplicably, made space for this new love to grow. The love for this wild, mysterious creature and her tiny, chaotic family. Mornings were no longer a struggle to get out of bed. They were a joy. I'd wake up to the feeling of a kitten pouncing on my feet under the covers, or the sound of Luna's soft chirp as she presented me with a toy mouse. The nights were no longer heavy with silence, but filled with the soft, sleeping breaths of 5 small creatures. I named the kittens. The adventurous black one with the white sock became Socks. A gentle, fluffy gray one became Smokey. A bold, striped tabby was Tiger. And the tiny calico, the one who looked most like her mother, I named Piper. They became my world, my reason to keep the place clean, to go to the store, to be better. Weeks turned into months. The kittens grew from helpless, mewling beans into sleek, playful mini panthers. The time came to find them homes. It was a heartache I had prepared for, a necessary sorrow. I interviewed people carefully, my protectiveness surprising me. Smokey went to a sweet elderly woman who lived alone and wanted a companion. Tiger went to a family with 2 kids who sent me pictures of him sleeping on their son's bed. Socks went to a young couple in a nearby town. Piper never left. From the beginning, she was Luna's shadow, her miniature replica in both looks and spirit. She had her mother's same intelligent, watchful eyes, her same regal bearing. Luna had chosen her successor. Piper would sit with her mother on the windowsill, both of them watching the world outside, 2 queens surveying their domain. When Luna went on her daily patrols, Piper would sometimes go with her, learning the routes, the secrets of the walls and the alleys. My life was softer now. The sharp edges had been worn smooth by the relentless, gentle pressure of purring cats and the soft pad of paws. The studio apartment felt like a home, a warm, lived-in place filled with love and life. The grief was still a part of me, but it was woven into the tapestry of my life now, not a separate, overwhelming thing. It was a thread, not the whole cloth. One evening, almost a year to the day since Luna had first appeared on my welcome mat, I was sitting on the couch. Piper was curled in a ball on my lap, a warm, purring weight. Luna was on the back of the couch behind me, her favorite new perch, one paw draped down to occasionally touch my shoulder. The window was open, letting in the cool night air. It was a clear night. The moon was full, a perfect, brilliant white circle in the sky. Luna saw it. I felt her go still behind me, her paw lifted from my shoulder. She stood up on the couch back, her body a silhouette against the moonlit window. She looked at the moon, and then she looked down at me. Her eyes glowed in the dim light. She gave a slow, deliberate blink, a kitty kiss. Then she hopped silently down from the couch and walked to the open window. She paused on the sill, looking back at me and at Piper, sleeping on my lap. It was the night of the full moon, her night, her time. She looked at me for a long moment, and I understood. She was going, but she was coming back. This was her ritual, her freedom. It was who she was. I gave her a slow blink back. I love you. Go. She vanished into the night. I sat there for a long time, stroking Piper's soft fur, listening to the sounds of the city. I wasn't afraid anymore. I didn't feel that cold knot of anxiety. I felt only a deep, abiding peace. She would return. She always did. The next morning, I awoke early. The first thing I did, as always, was look to the windowsill. Luna was already back, sitting there beside a sleeping Piper, meticulously washing a paw. She looked up as I stirred, her eyes meeting mine. She was home. I got up to make coffee, my feet padding across the floor. As the machine gurgled, I went to the door to bring in the newspaper. I opened the door, and there, centered perfectly on the worn welcome mat, was her gift. It wasn't a feather. It wasn't a stone or a piece of sea glass. It was a single, weathered, black and white photograph. It was bent at the corners and fuzzy with age, but the image was clear. A young woman, laughing, her head thrown back, holding a tiny black kitten up to her face. The kitten was batting playfully at her nose. The woman had kind eyes and a bright, open smile, and around the kitten's neck was a thin, red collar. My breath left my body in a rush. I knew with a certainty that shook my soul. This was Luna. This was her first human. The woman she had loved before me. The woman who was gone. This was where she'd gotten the ghost of a collar around her neck. This was the source of the button, the ribbon, the doll's shoe, artifacts from a life lost, treasures saved and cherished. This was the final gift, not a treasure from the woods, but a treasure from her heart, her most precious secret. She was telling me her whole story. She was trusting me with her past, just as she had trusted me with her future. I sank to my knees in the doorway. The photograph held gently in my hands, tears streaming down my face. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of awe. This small, incredible creature had loved and lost, just like me. She had known grief, and she had chosen to love again. She had chosen me. She had not just given me a family. She had given me back to myself. She had shown me that a heart that has been broken can still love, can still trust, can still open itself up to the terrifying, beautiful risk of connection. The love we have for those we've lost doesn't disappear. It becomes the foundation for the love that comes next. It's the soft earth in which new seeds can grow. Trust isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to be brave, to press your head against a waiting hand in the dark, to lead someone to your most vulnerable secret, to believe that they will handle it with care. I looked up at Luna, sitting on the windowsill, watching me. Her gold eyes were deep and knowing. She had given me everything. She had given me a reason to get up in the morning. She had given me a family. And now, she had given me the peace of knowing that love is a circle, never ending, always finding a way. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.